On this Thursday night, a timeline for the COVID-19 vaccine. New details on when Canadians could get the shot and who will be first in line.
When a vaccine is ready, Canada will be ready.
Plus, Ontario's dire new prediction about where its curve is headed. Constitutional rights versus pandemic restrictions.
Are these measures needed?
What is your right to personal freedom in the middle of a public health crisis? Plus, mercy for a mass murderer, why the sentence for the Quebec City Mosque gunman has been reduced, and an unparalleled ski season.
Just countless hours planning and prepping and reimagining everything that we do.
Hope on the hills for North America's biggest ski resort.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with more information about vaccines for COVID-19 and Canada's plan to roll them out. At this point, none has been approved, but several have shown so much promise in clinical trials, Health Canada could greenlight them as early as next month for use as soon as the new year.
As things stand now, we expect certain vaccines to become available in early 2021. However, it's important to note that the initial supply of these vaccines will be limited.
Dr. New says the first batch would be 6 million doses. Because 2 doses are required, that would be enough to vaccinate 3 million Canadians. 3 core groups would get them first: those at highest risk of contracting COVID-19, those at high risk of transmitting it to vulnerable people, and essential workers. Health Canada has given an emergency order to expedite the approval process of the leading vaccine candidates, and the government says it signed final deals with 5 of the 7 vaccine manufacturers it now has contracts with: Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Sanofi and GlaxoSmithKline, Medicago, Novavax, and Johnson & Johnson. Enough to supply 194 million doses to Canadians. Canada will have to rely on those companies to honor the contracts and ship the vaccine. And the closer we get to this becoming reality, the more the pressure mounts. That's where the political fighting begins. David Akin has our top story tonight.
My information had been given to us.
On vaccine delivery and distribution, a day of confusion.
Our understanding was that this had been finalized by the federal government. Now it appears maybe it is not.
And clarifications.
We expect to get 6 million doses of at least 2 of the 3 vaccines in Q1 of 2021. So that's part 1 of the answer. The minister is incorrect.
But more than one province has complained about confusion and uncertainty from Ottawa when it comes to vaccine delivery. So on Thursday, doctors and federal bureaucrats tried to set the record straight.
Our goal is to enable as many Canadians as possible to be immunized as quickly as possible against COVID-19.
Ottawa is already putting in place the freezers, the syringes, and other material that will be needed to deliver this mass immunization program. The military has been called in to help.
When a vaccine is ready, Canada will be ready.
And Health Canada said it is on a similar timeline to the U.S. when it comes to be able to issue approvals. U.S. regulators will decide December 10th if the Pfizer vaccine will get the green light. And since Canada is getting the same data as the U.S. at the same time, Canada anticipates no lag time in the approvals process. Still, vaccinations on this side of the border are unlikely to start in December. Instead, federal officials are confident that at least 3 million Canadians will be vaccinated starting in January and ending in April.
I think the most immediate hope is to protect those people on the front lines, the healthcare workers, give them some relief, and also the very most vulnerable seniors from infections.
Still, it will be up to the provinces to make the final decision on who is first in line for a vaccine.
And the country's premiers still have lots of questions about this vaccine rollout plan, and they'll get a chance to put their questions to the Prime Minister this evening when they all get together for their 22nd teleconference since this pandemic began. Donna?
Okay, David Akin in Ottawa, thanks. A vaccine can't come soon enough. Cases of COVID-19 are rising in virtually every region of the country. These are the active cases in Canada based on yesterday's numbers. Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta have more than 10,000 active cases. Alberta has the most, closing in on 14,000. That's more than Ontario, which has over 3 times the population. Yet Alberta has done the least to impose restrictions to stop the spread of the virus. In Calgary now, intensive care units are operating at overcapacity. The statistics, of course, aren't just numbers. They are people. One of them is 40-year-old Ricky Lam from Edmonton. His family says he was diagnosed with COVID-19 on a Thursday, and he died a few days later. To their knowledge, he did not have any underlying health conditions. Heather Yourex-West now on the human toll in Alberta as the virus keeps spreading.
Always full of life, always out exercising and energized and dancing on the dance floor and sweating it up.
Over the course of 3 days, Edmonton's Ricky Lam shared his symptoms on Instagram. At emergency because my breathing has suddenly gotten worse, reads the first post. Later, X-ray is apparently showing signs of COVID. He would later share he tested positive. And 3 days later, in his final post, breathing has become very difficult. Every few breaths I go into a coughing fit. It's so brutal, it doesn't allow me a chance to recover. At just 40 years old, Lam died the next day.
We're now at a situation where this has a life of its own.
Intensive care units across the province are now at or near capacity, and those on the front lines fear the number of deaths from COVID-19 will begin to sharply rise.
Certainly, in my view, the measures that have been put in place are very weak.
This former Alberta Chief Medical Health Officer also believes that recently announced restrictions don't go far enough.
That failure to be able to count on contact tracing means that we should be pivoting to the second strategy, which is the kind of lockdown we saw that was effective in the spring. And so that's what I would be pushing for.
For many decisions, I present a range of policy options to government officials, outlining what I believe is the recommended approach. The final decisions are made by Cabinet.
Dr. Dina Hinshaw has not said publicly what her recommendations to government were, but according to her predecessor, if there was conflict with government, there is little chief medical health officers can actually do.
It's a core competency of public health to be able to speak truth to power. But there is virtually no protection for the people who do that. So you can be dismissed without cause almost anywhere in this country on the whim of the government.
A difficult situation that ultimately the virus will judge, reflected soon in the number of new infections and patients requiring hospital care. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
Late today, Dr. Dina Hinshaw addressed the release of some audio recordings made in secret of government meetings she was involved in. The CBC says it obtained 20 recordings of daily planning meetings that it says reveal serious disagreements between the chief medical officer and politicians.
This is a personal betrayal and a betrayal of the trust that our hardworking team has placed in each other. I know that there are many views about how we should proceed. However, we are becoming divided when we most need to engage in respectful dialogue.
In Ontario, new modelling projects the curve is flattening in some areas, but it varies widely, and it's difficult to tell if it's part of a turnaround. Today, the province reported 48 new outbreaks. Cases are down in long-term care homes, but the number of deaths is still rising. So are hospitalizations, increasing 63% over the past 4 weeks. Occupancy in ICUs is also on the rise. Ontario's top doctor says right now no new restrictions are needed because the ones in place are having an impact.
There is some positive signs we're seeing, a good direction, but it's still precarious, and we have to watch that. And we're not as bad as we were, but we're not out of the woods yet in this matter.
A Toronto restaurant owner has become the poster boy of defiance against COVID-19 restrictions. He was taken away in handcuffs today after refusing to obey public health orders and close his place to in-person dining. Most Canadians have accepted the restrictions are in place to limit the spread of a deadly virus, but there's a vocal minority who believe their personal right to freedom trumps everything else. And as Eric Sorensen reports, some political leaders have given them tacit support.
When a public health lockdown is imposed and restaurants ordered shut, civil liberties are restricted. But is it unconstitutional? One restaurant owner in Toronto has been arrested after reopening this week and testing the limits of government power. He and others protested restrictions ordered by Toronto's medical officer of health. The city's mayor, on U.S. cable news, said there must be respect for the law in this country.
It is founded on the fact that if you don't like a law, you can go to court or you can seek office and try and change the law by getting yourself elected, but you don't just kind of thumb your nose at the system.
A similar response elsewhere. After an anti-mask gathering defied health protocols in Steinbach, Manitoba, the province's Conservative premier supported police issuing fines.
This is not about our opposition to protest. This is about our opposition to those who would disrespect public health orders.
Another large anti-mask march took place in Calgary on the weekend. From the premier of that province, a different tone around health restrictions. Jason Kenney says he's concerned decisions on the pandemic are being driven by ideology.
I am disturbed that in all of the COVID debate, there seems to be almost no discussion about the impact on fundamental rights and freedoms.
One specialist in health law was taken aback by Kenney's stance.
I agree that we shouldn't let ideology win the day. What we want to win the day is good evidence, good science, and a balanced approach to tackling this pandemic.
The Canadian Civil Liberties Association is concerned by possible government overreach and the uneven impact of restrictions on some Canadians.
There are at least very real questions about whether the restrictions that have been put in place are necessary and can be justified.
But while striking a balance on personal freedoms, experts say governments have a duty to protect the health of Canadians.
In extreme circumstances, governments have the right to act for the good of the people, and it makes the balancing act very, very difficult. But are these measures needed? Absolutely.
Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
There is no doubt some businesses are suffering, buckling under the weight of debt. And it's women and racialized Canadians who are disproportionately affected. Many work or worked in restaurants. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce warns bankruptcy could be just weeks away for some businesses. And as Abigail Beeman explains, it's urging the federal government to change some of the rules around the emergency rent subsidy program.
We have around 200 staff. We usually have a line up out the door. The place is packed at 750 people-ish. Now we only have about 8 staff.
I describe it as in walking on eggshells. We just don't know what's going to happen, even by the end of tonight, because the laws changed so much.
Hours cut, tips slashed. Thousands of restaurant employees live with the constant worry of another layoff, another shutdown.
I wake up as a president of the company. I try to look at our people in the eye and say, you know, is there something we can do today to make sure that we can keep your jobs?
Mo Jessa says the federal government's wage subsidy was critical for Earl's restaurants, but it's not enough. Global News obtained this letter from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce to Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, calling for changes to another program, the new Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy.
We want to make sure that everybody is treated equally.
Business owners can claim up to 65% of $300,000 in expenses. The issue is for owners of more than one place. The rules mean they need to split that amount across them all.
In our case, that's less than 10% of our rent costs across our business.
Paul Bogner's company has 7 brands and 58 restaurants. Monthly rent tops $2 million.
The government doesn't think that the jobs, the 5,000 jobs that exist in our company, are as important or important at all as the franchise or the single unit operator across the street who they're providing full funding for.
I do think that there should be a cap of some sort, again, to ensure that the program is helping as many types of businesses as it can, and not forgetting about the standalone businesses.
If our guests are not earning as much as they used to, then they won't be as generous to us. And then that is like a domino effect. And then if we go to Starbucks, we just don't have, for example, or Tim Hortons, we just don't have then, enough change to tip our baristas.
A spokesperson for Freeland pointed to the additional 25% rent subsidy top-up for businesses forced to close due to local rules. There's no overall cap on that. And a government source tells Global News the retooling of the rent program was done with the restaurant industry in mind, but they're certainly open to more feedback. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Some relief could be coming for restaurants in Ontario where in-person dining is banned. The province wants to slash fees that food delivery apps like Uber Eats and DoorDash charge. In Ontario, those commissions can reach up to 30%. The proposed law would cap delivery fees at 15%, and total charges would max out at 20%. The aim is also to ensure companies don't restrict their delivery zones or cut out certain restaurants. Something similar was done in New York City. A change to the sentence of the Quebec Mosque gunman coming up, why a court has ruled the original sentence was cruel and unusual. The man who killed 6 people in an attack on a mosque in Quebec City has had his sentence reduced. Alexandre Bissonnette was originally sentenced to life with no chance of parole for 40 years. Today, Quebec's highest court cut that back to 25 years without chance of parole. Mike Armstrong explains the decision and why it likely will be appealed.
It was a sentence that, from the minute it was handed down, didn't make either side happy. In fact, it was appealed by both Alexandre Bissonnette's defense team and the Crown. Now, Bissonnette pleaded guilty to 6 murders and 6 counts of attempted murder. Traditionally, that would mean 6 life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. But the sentencing rules changed with legislation in 2011, and the judge could have handed down consecutive sentences. That's what the Crown wanted, no chance of parole for 150 years. The defense wanted it concurrent, capped at just 25 years. Quebec Superior Court Justice François Huot went in a completely different direction. He handed down the 25 and tacked on another 15.
He decided that the legislation was unconstitutional, but he kind of rewrote it in a way that he felt it would be constitutional.
Well, in a decision handed down Thursday, the Quebec Court of Appeal says that was a mistake. The judge didn't have the power to add a new option, but it also went further. The appeals court is declaring the 2011 changes to the criminal code that made consecutive sentences possible invalid.
I'm glad that the court concluded that the legislation could give rise to sentences that are cruel and unusual, and it's now unconstitutional.
A spokesperson for the Quebec City Mosque, where the attack took place, says the community is hurt by the reduced sentence. He says they'll respect the justice system's decision, but questions whether actual justice has been done. While the debate is far from over, observers say it's a certainty the question of consecutive sentences will head to the Supreme Court. But it is, in a way, for someone like Bissonnette, basically academic. He can ask for parole after serving 25 years, but considering the heinous nature of the crime, he's very unlikely to get it. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
Vancouver City Council has voted unanimously to ask the federal government to decriminalize possession of small amounts of illicit drugs. The city will ask the federal government for an exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. It's part of a plan to develop a health-focused approach to substance use and end the stigma against drug users. 2020 is on track to be the worst year for overdoses. Last month, the BC coroner reported 162 overdose deaths, about 5 per day. If approved, Vancouver would be the first jurisdiction in Canada to decriminalize small amounts of street drugs for personal possession. Still ahead, the final offensive. Fears grow for civilians caught up in an Ethiopian conflict. The situation in Ethiopia is getting worse tonight. The country's prime minister has ordered the army to move in on the capital of the Tigray region. In a statement, Abiy Ahmed says the military offensive has reached its final stage. He urges citizens to stay home and away from potential targets. More than 40,000 Ethiopians have fled to nearby Sudan since the fighting began earlier this month. And this is the kind of honor usually given to heads of state. Tens of thousands of Argentinians lined up for hours to pay their respects to Diego Maradona. The soccer star dazzled the world and led Argentina to win the World Cup in 1986. He died of a heart attack yesterday at the age of 60. We're back in a moment.
Herr Präsident.
Germany's chancellor is calling for European ski resorts to remain closed until at least early January. Italy and France have shown support for the idea, but Austria has voiced concern. And mountains in Switzerland, which is not part of the EU, are already open. Ski resorts in Europe were among the first COVID-19 hotspots. Here in Canada, Whistler Blackcomb in BC opened for business today. It's got the snow and some pandemic protocols in place, but what's missing are the tourists and their money. Global's Paul Johnson is in Whistler. Paul?
Donna, you know, this was never certain, and of course things could change very quickly, but North America's biggest ski resort and Canada's most well-known opened for business this morning, and their intention is to try to stay open for the entire season. What's making this possible is the way they've organized sales and how they're managing numbers on the mountains. Their formula is this: they know what their capacity is for getting people up and down on the lifts and gondolas while observing social distancing. That tells them how many people they can accommodate, and those spots then have to be reserved online and in advance. So there are no walk-up ticket sales right now. The executives here say it's a work in progress, but they're asking for people to be patient.
The team has done an amazing job, and just countless hours planning and prepping and reimagining everything that we do so that we could operate. And our goal for the year is to get open and to stay open for the whole year, and today's the first step.
First day back, I'm so stoked we're open. You know, it's obviously a bit different than we all hoped, but the snow's better than last year.
Of course, the other big question here is what's going to be the story for all of the restaurants, bars, hotels, and service businesses that rely on big visitor numbers in order to survive? Well, that's most certainly going to depend on the status of the various travel restrictions across Canada and internationally, and whether at least some of those might be lifted at some point this season. But bottom line, the biggest economic engines of this place are the two mountains themselves. And with the lifts running, at least there's some hope. Donna?
All right, Paul Johnson in Whistler, thanks. And that is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. We leave you tonight with an update on Rocky. He's the little owl rescued from the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center in New York City. Well, Rocky has had his fill of the Big Apple, and after 10 days recovering at a wildlife center, there he goes. He's back in the forest where he belongs. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.